Okay, so let me first start by sharing this slideshow of debt and taxes, and it is on Blackboard. This exact one. I just updated it briefly, but yeah, you can find this on Blackboard. And the first thing I want to talk about is the foreign ownership of debt, because I think we rushed through this last time, and a lot of people told I wanted us to watch this Saturday Night Live skit that was a fictional meeting between President Obama and President Hu Jintao of China. And uh, the reason they put that skit on there is because I think the general public has this idea that China owns a lot of our debt and we're in trouble. Like that is bad. Um, it's almost like a way to shame our congressmen, to say they're irresponsible because they've allowed China to have control over us because they own our debt. We have to do whatever China wants because they own our debt. And I try to dispel that myth a bit and the things. But I am curious if you think it is bad that we have a foreign ownership of debt. We do. We have many countries, not just China, own our debt, and I've listed here as one of the cons, is it reliance on foreign capital. Are we relying on foreign capital because of this? What do you guys think? Um, in other words, like, we want to pay for stuff. The government wants to pay for stuff. We don't have enough capital, but we do it anyway because we're relying on uh, foreign money. That could be a con. In other words, that we're doing more than we should be able to do, and but the only reason we can is because of this investment from other countries. And if that were to disappear, we could no longer afford the government spending that we currently have. You may think that, but what about the national security issue? If we were to, let's say, have a war with one of these countries, um, how bad would that be for us? I've heard that China can trigger a collapse of the dollar by dumping all securities. What do you guys think? Nick, this is kind of the issue I wanted to talk about. China can trigger a collapse of the dollar. You mean the dollar itself? People will think the dollar itself is worthless, or maybe you just collapse. You mean um, collapse of the dollar? Well, thank you, Nick, for this comment. And I'm wondering if anyone agrees or disagrees. That I think what Nick is, so Nick was pretty clever here. He's not saying that he believes this. He's saying I have heard that. And okay, but I am curious what you believe. Thanks for telling what you have heard. But do you agree? That sounds like economic warfare. I'm not sure the international community would allow the U.S. dollar to collapse. Good point. Let's talk about what Colin said, that this couldn't just happen in isolation. It wouldn't just be China says I'm dumping all of my securities. Remember what Nick means when he says securities. He's talking about U.S. Treasury securities, also known as bonds, right? So if China dumps, and by dumps, I think he just means sells, right? So Nick is saying if China sells all of its U.S. Treasury securities, that would trigger a collapse of the dollar, and that's a real concern. Now, what does Colin say? The international community would not allow the U.S. dollar to collapse. I think this is a really good counterpoint, isn't it? Every country that holds U.S. Treasury securities isn't going to want them to all of a sudden become very low value, very worthless. And what could they do in response to China selling its securities? They could buy them, right? In fact, anyone could buy them. The issue is not, you know, China dumping these securities and no one's left to buy them. It's that the people who all around the world would like to hold US Treasury securities now have an opportunity to get some of them cheaper. So what could China do by doing this? They would affect the price of the bonds and they would increase the yield of the bonds. That absolutely would happen. And that, I think, is actually what Colin is saying, that the international community wouldn't allow it to collapse out of their own self-interest. They would say, well, shoot, if China's selling its securities, I can buy some, anyone can buy some, and all of a sudden they look like a pretty attractive investment. Let me say one more thing, though. The US Treasury securities are only attractive if you think the dollar is going to be secure in the future. If you're being paid back, if a bond that you own is being paid back in US dollars, but 10 years from now you think the US dollar isn't going to be very worth very much, then it's actually not a good investment. So this hypothetical situation where China dumps its securities, if it's doing that, but people still believe in the dollar, people still believe that it will be valuable far into the future, then, like Colin said, the international community would jump in, and I don't think would be much of a change. But if China did this simultaneously with something else that happened to sort of damage the credibility of the US dollar, I think actually then it could be like a snowball effect. Like they get the ball rolling where for some reason people in the European Union and the Middle East and investors all over the world, they really start to think maybe the US dollar isn't as safe as I thought it was. Conventional wisdom was that it was the safest investment in the world. So I've always just wanted to hold US Treasury securities, but China may be onto something here, that they're not going to be worth so much in the future. Oh, geez, maybe I'll start selling mine. That would be awful for us. We should talk about that. What happens when not just China, but if everybody says, I don't really want to hold US Treasury securities anymore? Okay. Robert, let's talk about Robert's comment too. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Most of the world's economy is backed by the dollar. Is that still true? I think that was true at some point, but the dollar isn't what it used to be. For example, the petrodollars, everything used to be. Oh, somebody's still coming. The petroleum used to be traded basically in dollars. Even people who weren't buying or selling and had no relationship to the United States were still using dollars as the exchange, the international exchange for petroleum. And I think that has changed. Yes. Yes, I am. Sure, yes. Okay. And where's my train of thought? Oh, of course, the emergence of China. Right. What has changed in the last 20 years? China went from being, a distant second, maybe third, having the third largest economy, maybe even fourth, if you go back far enough, to having the second largest economy in the world behind the United States, and growing. And so they do a lot of international business too. Anyways, it's still a good point that Robert made, that there would be this sort of global economic, I don't know about crash, but it would certainly be a very negative shock. That's true. And the international community would not want that to happen. What about China? What would happen to China if they did this? They would be hurting themselves, wouldn't they? If they caused some sort of economic catastrophe in the United States, they would be hurting themselves. Think of how much they export to the United States. It's huge. We have an enormous trade relationship with China and a lot of these countries. And actually, they would just be hurting themselves if they did this. That's my opinion. So is it a national security issue? So for that, I think you have to take it to the next step. Did I answer everyone's questions and comments? Let me say, what if there was a war? Not just like some bickering or something. our safety assumes continued extensive trade with China. Perhaps, yes. Um, Now, if there's a war between countries, then you might think they will hurt you, even if it comes at a cost to themselves. They will use every tool in their bag to sort of damage the economy of the country that they're at war with, and that's sort of the extreme I think it would have to go to. So, in my opinion, foreign ownership of debt, is it bad? Kind of only if you go to this extreme place in your mind where the full faith and credit of the United States is in doubt, or a country is completely at war with you and they are going to hurt you any way they can, even if it comes at a big economic cost to themselves, which I believe is pretty unlikely, but it's possible. So, but it's not because of what Saturday Night Live says. Saturday Night Live made it seem like we owe $1,000 to our brother-in-law, and we see him at Thanksgiving, and it's really awkward because he's like saying, "Oh, so I see you bought a new iPhone over there, but what about the money you owe me? You jerk. I loaned you this money, and you got to pay it back." And it creates this tension of, "Where's my money? Give me my money back." It's not like that. China is holding the treasury securities because it's a good investment for it. We didn't ask them to buy these securities. They did it on their own in an open market. So that's another thing to remember about foreign ownership of debt. It happens on its own. It happens, the word economists love to say is endogenously. Endogenous to this world, this model of how people are buying bonds is they're openly traded in a global market, and foreign entities want to buy it. So let's go to the pros. What's the good thing about this? It keeps our interest payments down. Have you thought about that? Every time somebody says China has 80 billion, I don't know why I'm doing this voice. I'm not particularly trying to affect a certain type of person. But if someone says China has $800 billion of our debt, we're in trouble. What you could say as a pro is that actually by buying our debt, they are keeping our interest payments down. You should always think of this like remember the auction metaphor? If you come to an auction and there's just a few people bidding, you're gonna get it for a low price. But if there's a lot of people bidding and it's really competitive, you keep raising your paddle every time, and someone else keeps raising it, and the price keeps going up and up. That increases the price of our bonds. And remember, that's the inverse relationship with yield. This is something I could ask about on a quiz, right? What is the relationship between bond price and bond yield? And the answer is that it's inverse. The higher the price, the lower the yield, because yield is the difference between how much the bond pays off when it matures and how much you had to buy the bond for the price. Okay, so when the price of bonds goes up, that is good for the United States. You guys understand why? It means we have to pay. I said we again, I made the mistake. The government has to pay less money in terms of interest payments. Because remember, whatever the bond yield is, that's the government just paying them. That's like saying we're going to lose this money, but it's worth it for us to lose it because it's interest payments on our debt. The lower our debt, the more money the government has to spend on something else, something that's called discretionary spending. And that's good. That's good for us. Or it's good for the government because they have more money to fund programs like education or defense spending, if you like, that sort of thing. Social Security and Medicare, those are not discretionary. That is entitlements. By the way, you guys know the difference between entitlement spending and discretionary spending. Entitlement sounds like a bad word, but it has the wrong connotation. It's called the government makes entitlement spending when there's a certain group of people that are entitled to certain benefits because of the law. There's a law written that says once you get above a certain age, you can start collecting Social Security benefits. You as a citizen are entitled to those benefits. Therefore, the government is spending it's entitlement spending because they have no control over it. It's already written as part of the law. Whereas discretionary spending is different. It's not like a law that says you have to spend this money. It's the government has some control over how much it spends and what. I mean, there's a budget, but they still have some control over what they're spending it on. And that's what I mean when I talk about entitlement spending versus discretionary spending. And so this issue with the debt, if we keep our yield, if the yield goes down because the price goes up, because people from China are buying our debt, okay, you want to buy our debt, fine. That means our yield is lower, so the government has to spend less on interest payments. It can spend more on discretionary spending. Okay. Let me address China. Colin, sorry, I called you China. I was reading the word China when I said that, so I do not associate Colin with China. That was just the reading mechanism in my brain and the speaking mechanism overlapped a little bit. With China owning so much of our debt, wouldn't that imply they believe in the full faith and credit of the US? Yes. Complexity of international politics aside, they're investing in our economy, right? Maybe. Are they investing in our economy? So I almost totally agree with that. And Colin, good points as always. I would say there's a different way to invest in an economy. If you're China, you want to invest in the United States economy, you can do that in another way other than buying our bonds. How would you do that?
So I think I don't have an answer for that question, but I think that kind of changes what my question is then to why does China, economically speaking, what is their motivation for buying so much of the US debt? Why are they doing that?
Good question, and it's safety. In my opinion, I'm not actually not an expert in international economics or macroeconomics at all. I'm a microeconomist. Sorry, you're stuck taking a course with a guy who's a microeconomist, and we're talking about current economic issues, and macro is a huge current issue that we're going to deal with. I'll be more of a specialist when we get to stuff like labor and externalities and things like that. That's what I personally do for my research. But here's how I would try to answer that. Wait, forget the question. Sorry, the question was, why? Why would China buy so much US debt? And I believe you should think of it almost like a hedge. Because when you're China, there's a lot of things in the world that you're worried about. And so most of the debt that China owns is not individuals. It's not like or even a corporation. I don't know if they have exactly corporations. They have something equivalent to it. Most of it is the central bank of China, which is strange, right? Why would one central bank be buying the debts of another central bank? I sort of think of the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve Bank as the United States central bank. I think it's because it's a very safe investment. It's a hedge against certain types of inflation. If for some reason there's really high inflation in China and the Chinese yuan becomes less valuable in terms of international trade, this benefits to that actually to China. They actually want their currency to be undervalued, and in fact, it has been for decades. In some sense, that China wants its currency to be undervalued because that's why Chinese products are so cheap. They get so many exports because of that. We import so much stuff from China. Why? Because from one of many reasons that economists, I should use the trick that Nick had. I've heard that the Chinese currency is undervalued. So, but by holding something like U.S. dollars, which are not undervalued, right? A lot of people want U.S. dollars. it sort of protects them and their total uh, on their asset sheets. I really can't explain it that well, other than it makes sense for them to, this is all electronic. This is all, there's no stack of US bonds sitting in a vault in a Chinese safe deposit box somewhere. At least I believe it's mostly electronic, and they do it as a hedge against inflation, and just as a safe investment that, of course, they're going to use it later. They're going to money will be coming in and going out of the Chinese government at all times, just like it is for the U.S. government, and it just makes sense for them, mostly because it's safe. I don't have a good answer other than that. But in terms of investing in our economy, I would say not as much as literally they could be investing in our corporations or our stock markets, and nothing stopping them from doing that. Or what else? There are other types of bonds. There's corporate bonds you can buy. There's municipal bonds. If they really wanted to sort of make an investment because they think the U.S. economy is going to just take off like gangbusters, they wouldn't invest in our bonds. They would invest in our more private, the I don't know what it's called. There are ways to invest in the private sector directly. That's what I'm saying. If they wanted to sort of make a lot of money, get a good return, they would invest in the United States private sector probably, even though that's a risky thing to do. The safe thing to do is to invest in the bonds. That's all my interpretation of it. Let's go on. We got a few more stuff to do. Is reducing the debt our priority? You can always finance the debt with more debt, so who cares? They've always been doomsayers, but we've had a debt since Andrew Jackson was president in the 1820s. There hasn't been a disaster yet. Most of the ownership of the debt is not foreign; it's still domestic. Over half of the debt is owned by some American entity. And let me shrink this. You can argue that we don't need to reduce the debt so much because one reason we have a debt is our government spending, and government spending, at least on infrastructure, helps the economy grow. You guys agree with that? Do you think there's some things the government can spend the money on that can actually help our economy grow? A lot of times this is all bunched together in something called infrastructure. Do you agree? First of all, do you understand what infrastructure is? And if so, do you think that can actually be as kind of an efficient way for the government to spend money? And then my question to you is why? Why would it be efficient for the government to spend money on infrastructure rather than letting private businesses or investors make that kind of investment? What is it specifically about the government that makes it capable of helping the economy grow through infrastructure spending? I mean, I think this is this isn't necessarily an economics point. This is just do you understand what infrastructure is point. Infra means below, I think. Structure means structure. Let me just say, unless someone has a comment, somebody chatted something. New Deal is a great example of infrastructure creating economic boosts. I agree. What did the New Deal do? It wasn't, the New Deal spending wasn't to sort of build factories that were going to produce things. It wasn't about building, it wasn't necessarily about spending money to build goods and services. It was actually about spending money to build the things that are used by factories to build the goods and services, like electricity that could come from dams, or hydroelectric dams, or what other spending was there in the New Deal? I should know this; it's important. But yes, that's the point. There's certain things that no individual would ever want to spend money on, like roads, right? If you had to spend the money to make all of the roads that you're ever going to use, there would be a lot fewer roads in this country. But we all benefit from having roads that are well maintained because it means we can move products around and the economy can actually run more efficiently than if everyone was kind of, you're on your own to build your roads. Why is it better that the government do it? Good question. Good question, Ryan. You know, I said better, and maybe I didn't mean better. Maybe what I meant was the government is the only institution that would be willing to do it. Can you name any other institution that would be willing to maintain the interstate highway system that we currently have? The interstate highway system in the United States is federally funded. Would any other institution be willing to maintain that? And we still use it a lot. A lot of what we buy in this country has been sent on a truck from one city to the next using the interstate highway system. It was a massive public project, infrastructure spending that happened under Dwight Eisenhower, a conservative Republican president who made this investment in the interstate highway system. And some people regard it as like the most successful public project of all time in terms of how much that government spending on it helped improve the economy. So good question, Ryan. When I said, and we can go back to the tape and hear me say this, that the government was better at it. Maybe what I mean is that the government is the only one who'd be willing to do it. Even a dam isn't, it's just so costly that yes, you can make some money off the dam, but the reason you can't actually make enough money off the dam to make the spending of the dam worthwhile is because the profits that you earn from generating electricity are also mitigated by the fact that we want everyone to have electricity, access to electricity in this country. So if we just said, okay, electricity is going to be controlled by the free market, anybody who wants to can generate electricity and sell it, but it's just going to be the Wild West out there. Just anything goes. The word is laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means the government won't interfere. That would be bad. And I can argue pretty quickly why that would be bad. There would be some parts of this country where it just doesn't, it's not profitable to supply electricity to them. Some rural areas of West Virginia or Western Virginia, not too far from here, there would be no profitable reason for a company to even supply any electricity to them. I don't know. I can't prove that. So I'm going off the rails here, but I still believe even for something like a dam, you couldn't count on private investment to build what would be an efficient use of a lake and a river that could generate electricity that a lot of people could use, because part of what we're doing that is for the public good. You're generating electricity so that people can have more electricity, not because it's profitable to make the electricity. That's my opinion. We should go on. So all of this is just, oh, sure, thanks. On all of this is like, the debt, we don't need to reduce the debt. Yes, it's 26 trillion. Yes, it's enormous, and our grandkids and great grandkids are going to be paying off this debt forever. But who cares? You can always just finance it with more debt. That's kind of what this argument is. Let me just real quickly talk about this classical, not neoclassical, but old-timey classical economist David Ricardo, who said that an economy, whether you have deficit spending now or higher taxes later, it's equivalent. In other words, you can spend money now in terms of a deficit, or you can tax people later, and it's equivalent, it's the same thing. Therefore, it kind of makes sense to, if you want to spend more money now, you can. Just think of it as higher taxes later. And you know, if spending now improves your economy so that you have a larger tax base later, then go ahead and do it. It's sort of a it's kind of a defense. It sounds like it's a criticism of deficit spending, but I think it's often used as a justification. In other words, if you want to have some deficit spending, go ahead. Just know that you're going to have higher taxes later, and it's equivalent. That's that point. Okay, let's think about reducing the debt is a priority. Sustainability. Can it just keep growing forever? But just think of how fast it's growing. You know, my slides used to say 20 trillion debt. Now it's 26 trillion, and that was just a year or two. That was really quick that the debt has grown. That's not good. And if it keeps growing forever, it just can't. It can't. It's impossible. It can't just keep growing really quickly forever because we'll run out of money. We'll run. Remember, every dollar of debt is being held by somebody with that money, right? This isn't money that's being generated out of nowhere, although we'll talk about that in a second if we have time. I have a clock on me. Okay. Efficiency argument that interest payments could be spent anywhere. If because of the debt you're spending a lot of money on interest payments, that's inefficient for a government. It'd be better to spend that money on something that could directly help a lot of people, like infrastructure. You want to spend your money on infrastructure. You don't want to spend your money on interest payments. How about a debt crisis? Do you guys know what a debt crisis is? What do I mean by that? I mean, people stop being willing to loan you money. Has that happened in the United States ever, where we've had a debt crisis, where the U.S. federal government had debt and they just couldn't generate enough money to pay back the people who they owe? Has that ever happened in the U.S.? I think the answer is no. The answer is no. But in other countries, it has. Can you guys think of another country? Maybe pay attention to some news during the Civil War. Was there a debt crisis in the Civil War? I don't know. I don't think so. Not in the sense where, not in the sense. Was there one in Mexico? Maybe. Oh, for the Confederacy, yes. Thank you, Nick. Yes, for the Confederacy, yes. I think there were some Confederate bonds that people had, and they just couldn't pay it back. Or I could be wrong about that. Maybe it was more like they were being paid back with something that was worthless, and of course people didn't like it, and they lost their money. USSR, sure. The country that I'm thinking of right now is Greece. Greece had a debt crisis just in the past decade. Maybe it was the first decade of the 21st century. And because they were in the European Union, the rest of the European Union was like, this is not okay. You cannot have this. You cannot let your dollar or I think they used the euro at the time. You can't let it fail because you're part of the European Union. So what they had to do was restructure their debt, and they had to face these austerity measures that the rest of the European Union said, okay, well, you can't, you got to curb your spending on these things. And so what happens with the debt crisis is usually that the bonds that you hold that have an IOU, you actually don't get all of them back. You might only get some fraction of them back. And that's actually really bad for a country to have that kind of a crisis, because it means people stop trusting you. When they buy a bond, they expect to get the full payment of the bond. And if you say, well, actually, we have to do something else, and sorry, we let's renegotiate this, that people stop trusting you if you're going to do that. So if there was ever a debt crisis in the United States, that would be really bad for us. We already talked about the foreign power, and we already talked about crowding out. Just a review of crowding out was, this slide here. That in this slide, I have quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal axis and the real interest rate on the vertical axis. And this idea is that when the supply of loanable funds goes down because people are investing in bonds, that's bad for private investment. I didn't actually show you this graph before. This is a graph. It's just a supply and demand curve that are intersecting, and the supply curve is shifting. I really think you should always, if you're going to be an economics major, you should really have this tool in your toolbox to just think about, in whatever situation is happening, what's the supply, what's the demand, and which curve is shifting where. That explains a lot in economics. So in this graph, we have SLF goes to SLF1. That's the supply of loanable funds. That light blue line is shifting to SLF1. That's the green line. And the reason it's shifting is because fewer funds are available when we have a higher debt. Government deficit spending means somebody out there has to use their money to buy. They don't have to, but they choose to. They use their money to buy the debt instead of making some kind of private investment. That's what this is saying. And we already talked about why this might be bad to have crowding out. You guys understand why crowding out is a bad thing for an economy? It's pretty simple. Like if I ask this on a quiz, what should you say? You don't have to go really deep into the woods here. You can just talk about how if fewer people are investing in private industry, then our economy suffers because private industry is what we rely on to produce the goods and services that we consume. So why is this bad for an economy? It's not that private investors can't get a loan. They can, but they have to pay a higher interest rate for it. And therefore, on the margin, there would be some marginal entrepreneurs who decide, you know what, I'm not going to do it. Let's just get out of this. Okay, so there's less private investment and therefore less economic productivity. That's how you can answer it. But if you do talk about the shifting curves, that's good too. That's even a more complete answer to realize, like here, let me be clear here. This is just the graph of private investment, right? There's another graph of bonds, right? You can imagine the demand for bonds and the supply of bonds. The supply is pretty fixed, isn't it? But anyways, you could imagine a second graph of this that's not private but public, or bonds. Okay. Ask me if you have questions about that. Do you guys know what quantitative easing is? I kind of feel like I'd be remiss to not at least mention quantitative easing, because it's definitely related to the debt. It's definitely related to whether or not the United States has control and enough money to keep down the debt payments. So, and I think the reason they do it is, well, I guess because they can. They want to, like I said, keep down the interest rates of bonds. Let me just say what quantitative easing is. It's when the central bank creates electronic money in order to buy government bonds. So this all just happens on a balance sheet on some computer somewhere. It's not really about creating physical money. It's about creating assets on a balance sheet in the United States Central Bank and using those assets to buy government bonds. What does that do? That keeps down the price. I'm sorry. That increases the price of bonds and lowers the yield. In the United States, there were 3 rounds of quantitative easing. So the first 3 rounds were done in response to the Great Recession. So there was a Great Recession that happened after the financial crisis of 2008. You guys probably were pretty young. You might not have, wasn't affecting your job market prospects because you were too young for that. But in between, so that's how the central bank responded by actually creating money and using it to buy bonds, right? So don't think of it as like they're just printing a lot of money and then taking that money and just uh, injecting it into the economy, like everybody gets this extra money that they printed. That would be really bad, right? Because that would cause a lot of inflation. If you just printed money and handed it to people, and everyone has more money, they're going to have more demand for these goods and services, and the prices are going to go up, and the value of each dollar goes down when you do that. That's inflation. Quantitative easing is like that. It's not quite the same. But it is a lot. 4.5 trillion was the first amount, and then 2 trillion just recently. They have a fourth round of quantitative easing, and some people were worried that this would have a bad effect on inflation. So even though you're not just printing money and injecting it into the economy, you are still creating electronic money assets, and so a lot of economists thought this is a really bad idea because it'll make inflation go way up. Truth is, it didn't. It didn't. It had a very small effect on inflation. There may have been more inflation than otherwise, but still, it's very low. So, just so you know, that's what quantitative easing means. Oh my gosh, it's already 10:47. I wanted to say a little bit more about taxes, but I only have 3 minutes. Oh geez, what I do? What have I done? Okay, can I say something about taxes now, about why taxes are what happens when taxes are levied? Um, the main point of why economists say all else equal taxes are bad is because once again it's like a shift in the demand curve for something. If you know you have to not just pay for a good, but you also have to pay a sales tax, on the margin, you're going to be less likely to want to buy that thing. And that causes a deadweight loss. Dang. Guys, what if I say let's say stop share. What if I say we'll have our quiz at the end of class Wednesday, and then I just want to finish up a few things about taxes before we have the quiz. I mean, it wouldn't make sense for me, I think, to talk about these after the quiz because it's stuff that could be relevant for the quiz. And just more specifically, it's these slides here, the ones about sales tax, the one about income tax, and the one about corporate taxes. Kind of saying why economists generally think that those taxes are bad. It's kind of a necessary evil, but I want to talk about why they cause a problem. We'll also talk about taxing the behemoth, which is about corporate taxes and moving abroad, things like that. And if it's okay with you guys, let's do that. Let's do that on Wednesday, and then we'll still have our quiz, but it'll be towards the end of Wednesday. So if you want to study now for the quiz, like get ahead of the curve, you can go to Blackboard and you can see those slides. I will talk about them before the quiz, and then we'll have our quiz about debt and taxes. And then on Friday, we will have another debate. So we'll talk about making taxes more progressive, and specifically why we might want to do that in order to reduce income inequality in this country. It's effectively a way to reduce income inequality would be to have a higher tax rate on the wealthiest Americans and a lower tax rate on the lower. It wouldn't fix income inequality, of course, but it would make it more equal. So we'll talk about that too. Would you guys have any questions?